Hi. I'm obviously recording this after I got home from church this morning, but just by way of introduction, the speaker for this morning is my son, Pastor Bryce Hamilton. He's a youth pastor at Brookside Baptist Church in Brookfield, Wisconsin. So enjoy the message this morning, and we'll see you in church next week.
Good morning. Good. Turning your Bibles with me this morning to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14. I've gotten all kinds of things in the mail, as he was mentioning. I've gotten his woodworking magazines. I've gotten invitations to local retirement planning events, which I'm nowhere close to. I've gotten his AARP mail, which he's not a member of, but they're trying to recruit him. I've gotten all kinds of things in the mail. I'm tempted to go to one of those retirement planning meetings because they have dinner for you and they have all that stuff going on. And I'm tempted to go and just be like, yeah, I just look really good for my age, but obviously I belong because you sent me that mail. But hopefully at this point you're in Matthew chapter 14, as was mentioned. We live out in Wisconsin. I'm a youth pastor at Brookside Baptist Church in Brookfield, Wisconsin. And we're happy to be here with you this morning. And Matthew chapter 14, we'll start in verse 13. But years ago, I was a member of a gym while I still lived in New Jersey and worked in New Jersey. And that gym was called LA Fitness, which you guys have probably seen going about your business. And the one that I used to go to on a regular basis was over in Cherry Hill, so not very far from here. But it was around New Year's, and that's when everybody starts coming to the gym again, right? It was around New Year's time, and a man randomly walked up to me and introduced himself, and he asked me about some exercises. He looked at me and he said, you seem to know what you're doing, and I have no idea what I'm doing. So what tips, what pointers can you give me? And during our first conversation together, he also learned that I was a youth pastor down the road at church in Mount Laurel. And in the months that followed, Pat and I had several discussions as we came and went from the gym, and many discussions about the gospel. And there was even one time, I don't know if you guys remember, that he even attended our church. But one day Pat gave me a call and Pat asked to meet. And he sounded pretty serious about this meeting, and so we happened to be headed to the gym that same day at the same time. And so we agreed to talk there. We met, we sat on the couches that are out there at the entrance, and I asked him what was going on. So he then began to describe to me his situation. For years, one of his close friends had felt trapped in an unloving marriage. And from his friend's perspective, his wife didn't respect him, and so he found it difficult to live life with her. He found it difficult to treat her lovingly, and until recently, he had put up with it. But now, at this point in their relationship, another woman started to give his friend some attention. And since they were close, this friend came to Pat for some advice. And to his shame, Pat disclosed to me that day that he had encouraged his friends to engage in an adulterous relationship. And after all, he said to his friend, "You deserve this after being trapped in this unloving marriage for so many years." Pat then turned to me and said, "I know that I encouraged him to do the wrong thing. His wife at this point has absolutely no idea what's going on, but eventually I know that this will come out and it will destroy his life and his family. Bryce, what do I do to make this right? Can I make this right?" You know, at the time, I was single, had no experience in marriage. At the time, I was only 22 years old and had no adult counseling experience. Although I had counseled hundreds of teenagers, I had no adult counseling experience. And I sat there across from Pat feeling totally and completely unprepared. What am I going to tell this guy? I have nothing to offer here, I thought to myself. I have no experience to draw from. I have no ability, no power. I have absolutely no business being in this situation, telling this guy how he should handle this difficult situation with one of his friends. You know, as a follower of Jesus, have you ever felt completely unprepared to help somebody? You ever known somebody and you're like, I I literally don't know what to do here. And in our passage this morning, that is exactly where Jesus' disciples found themselves as well. And so we'll turn our attention to Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 13. It says, "When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitude heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food.' But Jesus said to them, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples. And the disciples gave to the multitudes. And so they all ate and were filled, and they took up the 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." Up to this point in Matthew's gospel, Matthew has introduced Jesus at the beginning of the gospel as the Messiah who has come from the line of David. And that he's more than just a king, that he is the new authoritative teacher that is greater than Moses. And as he has come, he is Emmanuel, Matthew reveals to us, which means God with us. Then after announcing God's kingdom and explaining the kingdom's impact on day-to-day life, many during Jesus' ministry accepted Jesus as the true Messiah. Unfortunately, on the reverse side, there were also many who rejected Jesus, especially the religious leaders of Israel. And now here we are in Matthew 14, and Jesus is in a transition moment in his ministry. In Matthew 14, Jesus' ministry enters a period that Warren Wiersbe describes as the king's withdrawal. The beginning was the king's arrival and his explanation of what his kingdom would look like. But as we enter Matthew 14, Warren Wiersbe describes it as the king's withdrawal. Because it's at this point, from chapters 14 to 20, that Jesus often withdrew from the crowds to specifically prepare his disciples for 2 things. One was his coming death, and the other was their future ministries. And especially as we pick up in Matthew 14, because in Matthew 13, as we read through that chapter, we find out that John the Baptist was just killed. And Matthew records for us that when Jesus heard of John the Baptist's execution under Herod, that he departed from there by boat to a deserted place. And it's not a mystery why Jesus would depart after hearing of John the Baptist's death. I mean, John the Baptist was a relative and close friend of Jesus. But unlike you and me upon hearing bad news, Jesus was not leaving out of fear. Jesus didn't look at the death of John the Baptist as if it was the rise of hatred against him, even though that's exactly what it was. Surely Jesus was not afraid. And we know that because the time was soon coming when he would purpose in his heart, as Luke tells us, to walk purposefully towards Jerusalem, where he knew was his impending death. Instead of fear, the execution of John the Baptist signaled the growing antagonism towards Jesus, and Jesus sees this as the moment that is wise to withdraw. He sees it as the moment that it's wise to withdraw so that he can prepare his disciples. Jesus was taking this opportunity in order to mourn the loss of a faithful, beloved prophet and friend. But more than that, to prepare the disciples. Because what John the Baptist had already faced is exactly what the disciples had yet to face. And so he withdrew to prepare them to rest and to pray. However, this moment in Jesus' ministry does not indicate for us that Jesus ever stopped caring about the crowds. Instead, throughout these periods of withdrawal, we read that purposefully the crowds seek him out. And in this chapter, they find him. And he would, even trying to prepare his disciples, he would unselfishly take the time to serve them. And so it was in Matthew 14, starting in verse 13, that as Jesus came to this deserted place to rest, he came out from the boat and he saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion. Imagine having that kind of compassion. Losing a beloved friend and family member, and you go so that you can spend time with your close friends and rest and pray and prepare, and you go out and there's amusement park type crowds, which is something that none of us have seen for months, right? But there were amusement park type crowds. And there is a lot that we can learn from Jesus here, that he didn't come out of the boat and say, oh, let's go back into the boat and retreat to another place, but rather he was moved with compassion. And he departs from the crowds to teach his disciples, but yet the crowds find him. We know that at this point, both Jesus and his disciples were in desperate need of rest. Mark 6:31 tells us that during this time they were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat, that their ministry was so busy that they didn't even have time to sit down and take a bite of lunch. You ever get that way at work? And you're going through your day, and eventually you sit down, and your feet ache, and your stomach is empty, and you're like, man, I've been 8 hours without food, and now finally I have time to eat. At this point in their ministry, they were exhausted and hungry, but Jesus still did not turn the people away. Instead, he used this as an opportunity to prepare his disciples through serving the crowds and to teach them a valuable lesson. And the lesson was this: you might not have much to offer, but when you give what little you have to Jesus, the little you have becomes more than enough. And as Matthew unfolds this account, he presents this lesson in 3 stages. First, we see Jesus' deeds of compassion. Then as we read through, we see the misguided demands of the disciples. And then lastly, we see the miraculous distribution from the Lord. So let's turn our attention to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 14, where we first see Jesus' deeds of compassion. It says, and when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them. And he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. Jesus' response to the crowd was not typical. It was not like you or my response would be. I mean, imagine with me that you're one of the disciples, and you're exhausted. You've been serving with Jesus, and you haven't even had time to sit down and to eat. And one day, Jesus turns to you and says, listen, I know that we have been busy. I know that we have been coming and going, and there hasn't even been time to sit down and eat. And I know that we are all concerned about what it means for us that John the Baptist has now been killed by Herod. So let us go away, and we're going to take a few days vacation. We're going to rest. We're going to pray. And I'm going to teach you some important things. And so you, relieved, get into the boat with Jesus and the other disciples, and as you travel, maybe you picture landing on the other side of the sea, and you imagine landing on a beautiful, quiet hill with some trees for shade. You imagine pitching your hammock, your nice Eno, right? You imagine stringing it up on some trees. You imagine preparing your favorite meal and enjoying time with Jesus, your favorite person. And it will be such a relief after all your work, after all your coming and going, after your traveling, after your emotional distress with the death of John. Not to mention all the questions that you have regarding your future. After some time traveling, you reach your destination, and you're more excited than ever, right? You know, when it's time for that vacation week, and you finally get there. And so you've imagined all these things. You get off the boat, and oh no, there's easily tens of thousands of people. At least 10,000 people. Excited for the change of pace, you grab your things, head out for your boat, and instead of finding a quiet hill where you can pitch your hammock, more people. We've been coming and going among people. We leave to a deserted place to get away from people. More people. That ever happened to you? There's so many of them, and you think to yourself, I cannot possibly muster the energy to care for even one of these people, let alone for thousands. But as you turn to head back into the boat, you catch Jesus' eyes and, oh no, he's moved with compassion. You've seen it before, his unrelenting compassion for the people. You know, in this situation, I would likely have turned my back on the multitudes. I would have likely said, head on, folks. Don't you realize that I need a break? Don't you realize that I just lost a close, beloved friend? I'm not in the mood, and I don't have the strength, I don't have the emotional fortitude to deal with all of your problems today. Right? You ever thought that to yourself? I know I have many times. I can't even deal with my own issues, let alone all of yours. It would have been the natural thing to avoid the crowd, to get back into the boat and seek another place. But instead, Jesus was drawn to them out of a heart of compassion. You know, the word that is used here for compassion is only used 12 times in the New Testament. 8 of those occurrences, it is used to illustrate Jesus' heart for the people. Jesus used it 3 times in his parables. One time he used it to describe the master who had compassion on the servant that owed him an immeasurable debt. It's used in the parable of the Good Samaritan to describe the Samaritan who was moved with compassion towards the Jewish victim who fell among thieves. It's used in the parable of the prodigal son to describe the father who welcomed home his prodigal son. And only once is it ever used by somebody else besides Jesus or in reference to somebody besides Jesus. And it's when a father with a demon-possessed son begs for compassion from Jesus. Which, of course, Jesus grants him compassion and heals his son. This word for compassion is only ever used in connection with Jesus and his work with sinners. You know, isn't it wonderful to know that our God is a God of compassion? Compassion is a characteristic of God and how he deals with men in all things. In Psalm 78:38, Asaph writes that even though Israel was not faithful to God's covenant, yet he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and did not destroy them. Isn't that good news? That God moved with compassion even though Israel was not faithful. God has always been a God of compassion and a God of mercy. Our God is not a distant God. You know, even though all the world be distant from us, and that has brought on new meaning here in 2020. Even though all the world be distant from us, our God is drawn to us out of a heart of compassion. He is not cold concerning men's needs. He sees your confusion. And there's been much confusion in 2020. He sees your confusion, your suffering, your loneliness, your despair, and he cares for you just like he cared for this crowd. Jesus had compassion on them even though they didn't deserve it. We know they didn't. Jesus had compassion on this crowd even though they followed him, not because they believed, but because they wanted to be wowed by his miracles. They wanted to see what he had to offer. According to John 6:2, a great multitude followed him because they saw the signs which he performed on those who were diseased. At the end of this account, in John chapter 6, many of these same people left him, never to return. Many of them would ultimately reject him, many of them would undoubtedly stand before Pilate and say, "Crucify him." And Jesus knew the heart of this crowd, and yet he had compassion on them regardless. Concerning Jesus' compassion that day, John MacArthur notes, even as he lovingly healed their bodies, he had an infinitely greater concern to heal their souls. Even after Jesus healed the body, it's possible to become sick or crippled again. But when he heals a sin-diseased soul, it is forever freed from sin's dominion and penalty. And the way that Jesus was moved with compassion and dealt with this crowd on that day pointed to an even greater deliverance from sin. And so in order to serve the multitudes and to point them to their greatest need, Jesus put aside his need for rest, because he was a God of compassion. But not only is compassion a characteristic of God, but in this passage, as well as many others in the New Testament, but in this passage, it is also an attribute which God calls us to. Being made in the image of God, God expects us to exercise compassion just as he exercises compassion. Remember the parable of the compassionate master who forgave the immeasurable debt to his servant? This servant owed him a debt that could never be paid in multiple lifetimes. But later on in that same parable, that same servant had the opportunity to show compassion to his fellow servant. He goes and he seeks out another servant that owes him a small amount of money, and that servant falls on his knees and begs for compassion. And that servant, who is forgiven much, completely fails and shows no compassion. And when the master hears of his lack of compassion, he becomes angry with him. The question that hangs over that parable is, how can someone who has benefited from so much grace not equally be gracious with someone else? The master becomes angry, and rightfully so. And by the end of the parable, the expectation for us is crystal clear. Just as God is compassionate towards you, you are to be compassionate towards others. So God is a God of compassion, and he calls us to be compassionate. Now keep imagining with me that you're one of these disciples, and you thought you were going to a desolate place to rest, but instead you find a massive crowd waiting for Jesus. You hope maybe Jesus will pass them by so that you can finally have some peace and quiet after coming and going among people, so that you don't even have time to eat. But Jesus does not respond like that. And so for the time being, you swallow your own preferences and you begin to serve. The hours pass, and it becomes late in the day, and you begin to feel nervous. We can't keep people here much longer. You think to yourself, we're miles away from the nearest town, and even if we weren't miles away from the nearest town, there's no way that even one town could provide for the needs of a crowd this size. And so you go to Jesus in verse 15. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away that they may go into the village and buy themselves food." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Imagine being one of those disciples. We know from John's account that Jesus had brought up this issue earlier in the day of feeding the crowds. In John 6:5 it says that when Jesus lifted up his eyes, seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Apparently, that question had been on the minds of the disciples for the rest of the day. I mean, imagine. You think you're going to rest. You come out of the boat. There's amusement park-sized crowds. Jesus turns to you and says, "Okay, I've got a job for you. See these thousands of people? Figure out a way to feed them. I'm going to go serve them. While I do that, figure this out." Imagine that. Apparently, they thought about that the rest of the day, and they were no closer to finding an answer to that issue by the end of the day. Out of options, they come to Jesus and say, "Send the multitudes away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." Feeling frustrated and unprepared, it seems that the disciples panicked. And the form of the verb translated send is in the imperative mood. In other words, the disciples are telling Jesus what to do. Jesus says, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to figure this out. It's your responsibility to feed them." They come to Jesus by the end of the day and say, "Jesus, there's only one option. You have to send them away. There's no other choice." In other words, they're coming to Jesus, the King of the universe, and saying, "Jesus, you're out of options. Here's what you got to do. Send them away and let them provide for themselves." Now, all of us might be tempted to think that had we been there, we wouldn't have let this situation get the better of us. Surely, we think to ourselves often, as we read this passage, surely I would have remained calm. I would have expressed my concern, and I would have told Jesus that I trust him regardless. But how many times have we felt overwhelmed and we run around in a frenzied panic? We feel unprepared, and therefore we fail to recognize that the God of the universe is before us. Just like we'd respond, they respond. Despite having spent time with Jesus and seeing his awesome power, the disciples failed to look to the Lord to provide for this overwhelming need. To make matters worse, Jesus responds to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." In other words, at the beginning of the day, "Hey, figure this out. You got 5 hours." By the end of that time, they come back to Jesus and say, "There's no options. You have nothing that you can do except to send them away to the villages." And Jesus doubles down on you and says, "No, you're wrong. There is another option. Figure it out." So the pressure's on. Jesus is not going to send them away. You got to figure it out. Instead, Jesus commands the disciples to give them something to eat themselves. And so again, putting yourself in the disciples' shoes, you're already tired, but Jesus is relentlessly compassionate, not just to heal their diseases, but also to feed them. And you have put off this problem as long as you possibly can. You've laid aside your own need for rest. You're not even sure, hey, if we could send them to one village, you're not even sure if one village could provide for them. And so you say to Jesus, you're out of options. You have to send them away to the multiple villages. Jesus, you have no choice here. Only to have Jesus turn around and respond to you, "No, it's your responsibility to feed them." And so frustration is added on top of frustration, and you say, "Listen, all we got is 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And Jesus' response is, "Great. That's enough." And so we see Jesus' miraculous distribution starting in verse 18. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And looking up, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples. The disciples gave to the multitudes, and so they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. And Jesus' response to the disciples' complete frustration is, "Great. 5 loaves and 2 fishes. You easily have 10,000 people. Bring me the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That's more than enough. You should have just done that in the first place." Imagine Jesus telling you that like a little kid's Lunchable would be enough to feed an amusement park-sized crowd. And it's at this point that maybe we start to get it and start to understand. Jesus had purposefully brought the disciples into a desolate place to teach them, and teach them he did. He knew the crowds would follow him. He knew that the disciples were tired. He knew that the disciples felt like they didn't have enough energy to serve. let alone the means to provide for thousands of people. Yet Jesus insists, I want you to serve and I want you to feed them. Do you see it now? Jesus is preparing them for their future ministries. He is teaching them that there will be times that they'll think to themselves, I have nothing to offer here. I have no experience to draw from, no ability, no power, no business attempting to help people in these situations. To which Jesus responds, I know. That's the entire point. Bring what you do have to me. Jesus expected the disciples to have compassion just as he did, but he didn't leave them hanging. He provided the means by which they would give compassion. He provided the means by which they would serve. And they would serve not out of their own ability, their own power, but out of his ability, his powers, because they were his representatives. Jesus knew perfectly well that to do anything that he was going to call them to do in their futures, they would need him. And it's at this point that we get to the primary focus of this account in Matthew. With the food in hand, Jesus had the multitudes sit down, and he gave thanks to his Father, and he broke the loaves. And notice what he does. He then gives the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples do feed the people. The disciples who felt so ill-equipped for their calling. Feed these thousands of people. We have no means to feed them. We only have 5 loaves, 2 fishes. I know. And I want you to take what you got, bring it to me, and I will make it enough for you to serve all these thousands of people. The disciples weren't able to find much food for the people, but when they trusted the Lord, the little tiny bit that they had became more than enough. So imagine with me one more time that you're one of these disciples. You begin the day, you're exhausted, you're hungry, you're hoping for some much needed rest, but quickly you realize that Jesus is not willing to ignore these people. His compassion is relentless. And so you begin to serve alongside him. The hours get away from you, and as dusk approaches, you go to Jesus and you tell him that there's no way that you can feed all these people. And Jesus turns to you and says, we're not sending them away. I want you to feed them. You know, another disciple was able to find 5 loaves and 2 fish, but what is that going to do? Absolutely nothing. And so you go to Jesus and you say, this is all we have. And he says, good, bring it to me. And so you bring him the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and you stand amazed as you literally watch the creator of the universe create food for thousands of people. He gives it to you, and he enables you to serve. And exactly what he asked you to do is exactly what he enables you to do. And as the events of the day come to a close, the crowd begins to go home into the night. You notice that Jesus didn't just create food for the thousands, but he created more than they could ever possibly use. You could not meet such a great need, but the Lord took what little bit you had and made it more than enough. So years ago, as I sat there with Pat, I knew there is nothing I can do here. I cannot speak from a position of experience, but what I could do is I could present to him the gospel. I could tell him what was important was not what had happened in the past, but what his response currently was to Jesus Christ. I could assure him that his friend could rely on Christ to change him into the kind of man that could love his wife regardless of how she treated him. I could show him from the Bible that there was hope for his friend's family. There was no erasing the past, but there's hope in Jesus Christ. At the end of our conversation, Pat thanked me for taking the time to listen and to care for him. Pat was searching. And I believe that Pat is more open to the gospel today, if he has not already received the gospel, than he ever was before. And God was able to take what at first I was like, I don't have any clue what to do. And you know what? As I progressed in the conversation with him, I never had a clue. That's the reality. But I knew the answer to man's depraved heart, which is Jesus Christ. Pat is more open to the gospel today than he ever was before. And I thank the Lord that he gave me an opportunity on that day. How about you? Do you feel ill-equipped in your life? And I would venture to say that every single one of us do this year. We are dealing with issues and problems that we have never dealt with before in our lifetime. People are asking us questions that we've never thought we would have to answer. Do you feel ill-equipped to minister to the people in your life? I would dare say that for every single one of us, the answer is yeah. We don't know what we're doing. Maybe you even prayed today, Lord, I just don't know what I can do with this. All I got is this little bit. What is that compared to this great need? Jesus' answer to you is, I know you don't have much, but bring that to me and watch what I can do. This morning, will you bring that need to Jesus Christ? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for how clear it is in your word that we have absolutely no power to be of help to others, let alone ourselves. There are situations that every single one of us are even dealing with in our own life, and we are thinking we have no idea what to do. We have no idea how to serve. We have no idea how to overcome. But we do know what it is to walk in faith. Father, our life is not about walking and knowing what comes next. We know that. We know that that's clear in your word. You've told us in your word that we walk not by sight, but by faith. And so as we take those next steps in ministry, as we take those next steps in our personal life, as we take those next steps in following what you have called us to do, that we would completely trust in you, that we'd bring those needs to you. We don't know what the next step is, but we do know that you direct our steps. Father, we love you and we trust you with all of this. And pray in Jesus' name, amen.